Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of our corporate sponsorship webinar series hosted by Cosmos Sports and Entertainment. My name is Evan Colborn. I'm the Director of Business Development with Cosmos Sports, and here with me again is Cosmos President Carrie Kaplan. Thanks very much for joining us again. So the series is brought to you by Central Counties Tourism and Sport Durham. So very special thanks to both those groups for putting on this webinar series. For those that this is their first webinar, welcome. For those that are returning, this will be a continuation, just like the rest of the series so far, a continuation of our last episode. The whole course designed to be very sequential and building upon each episode to really talk about the entire sponsorship sales process. So before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items as usual. If you have any trouble seeing the slides behind us, don't worry. We're going to provide all the slides to everyone who is registered for the webinar. So don't worry about getting every word down that's on the slide. Everything will be provided to you. If you have any questions, in particular for today's topic, so today's topic is objection handling. And so if you have any questions, any objections that you've been facing in your own sponsorship sales process, or any objections you've really found tough over the years to overcome, please feel free to submit those through either the live chat. So if you're looking at the YouTube page and you're not in the full screen mode, you look at the top right corner of the page, you'll find the live chat. Michael, who's off camera here, will be monitoring the live chat throughout the broadcast. So we'll try to address any of those objections at the end. And if for whatever reason you have any questions and you can't get them in during the live chat or during our broadcast today, please feel free to submit any questions by email. You can find all of our emails on cosmosports.com. If you go to the team page, you'll find all of our emails, including Carrie's and mine. So please feel free to submit any questions, and we'd be happy to address those afterwards. So just with the technology and live streaming, there is a bit of a delay. So if you do submit questions at the end, there's a chance that we may not get to them. We just may not see it on our end before we actually wrap up live here. So submit questions as you think of them throughout the broadcast. Don't worry about waiting until the end at the Q&A portion to submit those. So, right. So as I mentioned, today's episode is common sponsorship objections and how to handle them. So this is a really important topic, one that almost certainly anybody that's involved in sponsorship sales is going to face. So we really wanted to make sure that we address this topic. I have to venture, I guess, pretty rare circumstance that anybody would ever get through an entire sales process and not come to some objections. So really important topic that we want to address. It's also a topic where it can feel a little bit overwhelming to some people, because if you start to think about it, there can probably list any number of objections as to why someone wouldn't want to sponsor your particular event. So it can be a little bit of overwhelming for people too, right? Yep. It's also it can be tough for people, because this is kind of maybe that first time where you actually have to push through a little bit, and I know we find with particularly people just starting out, pushing through that first no can be a little bit tricky.
Yeah, I think I think if you're in the business of procurement or sales or sponsorship, you have to realize that it's a numbers game. There's going to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of objection. It's a baseball player is in the Hall of Fame if they get out 60% of the time, and that I think there's some similarities there. I think if you get upset when an individual or a company says no, and sometimes people are going to be not always friendly or rushed, so I think a big skill in objection handling at first is accepting it as a fact, and also not being afraid, as you said, to sometimes fight through. Sometimes the initial objection is not a real objection, so there's something about fighting through that.
Yeah, exactly. So for today's agenda, a couple things we're going to address. One is recognizing the common objections and how to categorize them a little bit, so that you're not dealing with every objection under the sun, that you're dealing with fewer objections and recognizing when there's a common trend there. Second is how to actually overcome that objection, how to counter it in a way that's productive and not argumentative or anything like that. And lastly, we're going to go through a really specific technique called the feel, felt, found technique, a very tactical way to actually address an objection when you're meeting with a prospect. So really, we're talking about objection handling. I always think it's helpful to share a definition, just so we're all making sure we're all talking on the same page. So objections really are just concerns or issues or challenges or something that the prospect brings up at some point throughout the sales process. That's really all we mean by objection. And objection handling is just how you, as the seller, are helping to alleviate that concern, or how you're offering a counter to their concern or something like that. So that's just to square that away right off the top. That's kind of the definitions of what we're talking about today. Objection occurrence. It's also important to note that objections are not all going to come at once. They're going to come at various points throughout the sales process. They come at the beginning, they come at the end. As we're going to discuss throughout here, some objections are more common to certain kind of phases of the process. But you have to be kind of ready at any point to handle some form of objection. So can't really wait until all the objection. They're not going to save all their objections to the end. So you have to be ready for that. Can happen as early as when you're trying to set that initial meeting. Can happen well after a proposal's been presented. And you want to be ready with, so the whole point of today's conversation is you want to be ready so that when those objections arise, you have an answer, and one that continues to instill some confidence and build some trust with the other person. So one thing we did want to just kind of highlight, just kind of off the top, and this is a quote from Dale Carnegie. He's the author of the book How to Win Friends and Influence People, and he talks about how you can't win an argument. So we did want to make that distinction that objection handling is not arguing. It's
the first sort of plug and is, to me, and I've been read a lot of business books in my life. I probably, I don't know, it's well over 100. The best one I ever read is it was one of the first ones, is by Dale Carnegie. And it doesn't sound like a business book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, but if you're going to take one book and read it, it's really life lessons, and so it's great. And absolutely, as you're saying, Evan, I think a problem with objection handling. So, for instance, if you represent a hockey team and somebody says, "Well, I don't like hockey," arguing with them by saying hockey's great, you don't have a chance. In other words, if you're arguing with the person giving an objection, you're in it. Or somebody says, "My budget's spent for the year," and you say, "Well, what do you mean your budget? Is it really spent for the whole year?" You're creating an argument. I think what you have to do is there's a bit of accepting and then moving on. So, and we'll have some specific examples here, but the concept is we're not interested, and going with that. Oh, I understand you're not. Okay, I appreciate you telling me that you're not interested. Do you mind if I ask why? That's not arguing. That's saying you're not interested. And you're not interested. Okay, I accept you're not interested. I accept you don't like hockey. I accept you don't have money. I accept you're too busy to take this call. So I think the starting point is, don't fight the objection. Go with the objection, listen, and then see if you can maybe offer a solution.
Right. And it's also, just to, alleviate any kind of concerns, because, sometimes, objection handling can kind of be thought of as, the real kind of salesy kind of stuff where you're, kind of tricking somebody into thinking. But it's really, when you're handling these objections, you're trying to come at it from a place of their best interest. So if they have an objection and you truly believe that, you have a way to help overcome that objection, that's kind of objection handling. It's not tricking anybody.
No, I think if there's one thing that comes out of all this seminar, is if you're thinking that you're a salesperson or you have to make a deal or get something done, you're going to be unsuccessful. If you're thinking about communicating with somebody, really listening, trying to solve their problems or meet their needs, that's how you're going to find solutions.
Sure. Great. So some good news. So while we kind of said that it can be really overwhelming, there's lots of objections, lots of reasons out there why somebody may choose not to sponsor your event. The good news is that you found that you can really categorize it down to pretty well 3 simple objections, and you've really found the price, time, and product is.
Yeah, it's one thing I almost came upon it a little bit early in my career. I think because it's, as you say, daunting, right? There's a million different objections. We don't have money, or we don't like your event, or and really out of almost necessity, because I think when I was starting, it's a bit of panic, like you're overwhelmed. There's 90 objections. it was saying, as you said, really there's three categories. So if you think of all of people's objections for anything, for, you have a great event and you love it. Why is somebody not interested? It's either money, time, or product. So, and that helped me. And I think for those people listening, help just simplify it. So what I mean in that, somebody could say, I don't have a budget. I can't afford it. It's too expensive. Those are all money questions. The time questions are, you caught me at a bad time. We don't make decisions now. We're changing personnel. There's a new president. All that relates sort of to timing. Product is, we don't sponsor festivals. We don't believe in baseball and you have a baseball team. We don't. So really, now that, they're wide and they cover a lot, but really if you can, and people, everything falls in there. Virtually everything falls in there. So now sometimes it's all three. You can say, I don't like your event. I don't have money and I'm busy. But I think if you can narrow down which of these objections it is, ideally it's one, and then you can start to target it. So I just think this, for me, that's always been helpful, just to take some of the fear out of it and say, look, there's three reasons why people are not going to work with you. Yeah. So it's always been helpful to me.
Yeah. And like you said, an objection could really it could overlap as well. Right. So, an objection about our budget is spent for the year, it could kind of be a time objection because, it's the time of year that you're reaching out. It could also be a price objection. So you mentioned at the beginning, kind of pushing through that first no, and the way, you've described it to me is the true objection, trying to really understand what is the true objection. So someone says our budget spent for the year. Is it, I just happened to reach you at the wrong time, or is it, it's too expensive? Or
see, that's a good, and I know we're going to talk about budget. It's one of the main objections here, but that's a really good example. So if someone says, we don't have a budget, it feels like a price objection, dollars, right? Not money. But if then you ask a second question, when do you reset your budget? They say, January 1st. Well, it's not a price. It's a time issue. It's not price at all. Their budget might be 5 times what you might have a package for $5,000. They might have $1 million budget. So if you don't really listen and find out, you're going to think it's a money question, but really it wasn't a money question at all. It was a timing question. So I'm saying some of those questions, if it can help put you in one of these bubbles, or one of these bubbles is more prominent than another, that's important. Product, there's a lot of companies that will say, hey, you're not in we have 4 things that, everything has to fit in one of these 4 pillars, and your event doesn't fit in that. Now, if you know that, maybe there are elements of your event that does fit into community giving or a charitable contribution or cause marketing, or so. Anyways, I think, again, I was spending a fair bit of time on it here, but I think that to me, more than anything, it diffuses the insanity of, but there's 100 objections. And I think this says, well, there isn't. There really isn't. You can qualify them.
For sure. And it's, similarly, it could be, that objection example of our budget is spent for the year, might be a polite way of saying I'm not interested in it might be a product objection as well.
That's
so
right.
You really do need to probe a little bit more
to
try to find the true objection.
Right.
So to dig in a little bit more on price, because price is for sure one that's probably one of the more common objections that people face. Would be price. Even in those circumstances where in your earlier stages, you got a really good budget, they gave you a number, you've put together a proposal, comes in under budget, delivers what they're looking for. Price is still probably going to be an objection you might face, because just the price negotiation seems to be kind of baked into the sponsorship sales process. So you have to be ready for this objection for sure.
Yeah, and it's baked into life a lot. I mean, I think this is the challenge of negotiation, and I think there's a bit of some gamesmanship in there. If, people, you think of when you're at a flea market and, somebody says it's $10 and you say, I'll give you 3. Well, you might have fully intended of spending 10. You might have walked in and said, okay, I have $10 in my pocket. I think that's a really nice scarf. I'm willing to spend $10 for it. But there's almost that inherent to not say yes right away. So I think that whole price, that can be in a bigger scale too. So again, it's to your point, what's the real objection? What's the real number?
So some examples like we've already touched on, that are on the board here. Our budget's set for the year, so we don't have any room in our budget. It's too expensive, or probably a little bit rarer of an objection, but they may say, we've done similar sponsorships and it was less expensive for the same type of thing. So all type of price objections. But I guess, what are some of the ways you can try to overcome some of these price objections?
I think, excuse me. I think I think a big part of that is to understand what their budget is or how much money they have. So questions like, what's your maximum budget, or what's a ballpark, or what are you looking at spending? I think a big thing on this is to understand what where's the range, so those questions are good. So I think not being afraid to ask those questions is important. I think if you can understand where they're coming from, what their budget is, as you say, they spent something similar before. Okay, what did you spend before? And did you find it effective? And it doesn't have to be just sponsorship. Somebody said, hey, we buy ads on Facebook and we spend $10,000 a year. Okay, well, now you have a parameter. So I think that helps.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things that, so before we move on to kind of the next step, this, the objection is most likely to occur kind of at that proposal stage. This is when you've finally got into the kind of the dollars and cents and everything. Most price objections are going to happen then. With price objections in particular, one thing we did want to kind of touch on is that pricing integrity concept, and the fact that, when someone does bring up, it's too expensive, or, we don't have the budget this year. The easiest thing to do would be to kind of give in a little bit, like your flea market example. If I want to sell the thing for $10 and someone offers me $3, the easiest thing would be to say, fine, I'll give it to you for $3. Why do we really encourage people not to do that?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Evan. I think a lot of people, and this is a good one to listen to. I think a lot of you guys listening may give in on this. So you say, we have a booth at our event, and the booth is $1,000. And Tim Hortons comes to you and says, we'd like to have the booth. We'd like all the things that go with the booth. We'll give you $100. There's a natural temptation. You don't have any money now, and say, okay, we'll do it for $100. The problem is you're compromising your integrity. That doesn't excite. I mean, Tim Hortons may get a deal then, but if I'm Tim Hortons, I'm thinking, well, why did you try and sell it to me for $1,000? So it's dishonest. It's not what it's worth. It's like you were trying to rip them off. So when that happens, and you say to Tim Hortons, the booth is $1,000, and they say, we'll give you $100. Even though you want Tim Hortons as a sponsor, I think what you want to do is say, well, I can't give you the booth for $1,000, but for $100 I could do this, or for $300 I could do this, or for $500 I could do this, and it's some variation. Maybe it's a slightly smaller booth. Maybe it's a booth's there for Friday and not Saturday. But I think it's really important, and again, I think people have to be careful, because there's a huge tendency in the industry to not do that, to not hold your integrity, to say something's $1,000 but be willing to take $100. It compromises what you're doing, and it's not fair to the 2, 3, 4 sponsors that you're going to have. So a level of pricing integrity is very important.
Right. And similarly, if last minute type of things, there can be this tendency to last minute reduce prices because you just want to get them in for the event, and you've only got a week until the day. So
Right.
But same thing is, you want to hold firm on the pricing integrity.
Well, part of it is your disadvantage. What about the person that paid a month ago? So when you do that deal to Tim Hortons and they get to come in and have a booth for $100 that was $1,000, what about Canadian Tire, who pays $1,000 every year? Who's your best sponsor in the world, and every year they pay $1,000 and they take a booth. What if the person from Canadian Tire was standing there and they found out what you just did? If anything, the last minute person should be paying more. That's the airline model. Think about how an airline does it. If you're flying on Air Canada and the flight was $500 and you want to go tomorrow, even though the plane's empty, the flight's $1,000. And they're doing that correctly. You may look at it and say, oh, they're gouging me. They could keep it the same. But if they reduced it from 500 to 400, they'd be doing it wrong, because then people would wait to the end. It wouldn't be fair. Why should someone who book their trip home for Christmas in March, not get the best price. So if you want to criticize Air Canada, criticizing them for raising it, but they shouldn't reduce it.
And like you said, so to maintain that integrity, you can adjust the package, you can remove items, and we also know from our webinar on valuations and in pricing things that it is a bit of an art. It's not an exact science. So you do, I guess there's maybe a little bit of wiggle room on price. It's not a fixed firm number and take it or leave it kind of thing. But better is if you can remove items and keep the value relative to the
better is, and you're right. I mean, if somebody says $1,000 and you said to Tim Hortons, maybe we give it to you for $900 or something. In other words, I think there's some subtlety, as you say. It's not a perfect science, and there should be some small room potentially for discounting or making a decision early. But you have to be really careful. You have to be honorable to the other people that have bought,
for sure.
Excuse me.
So the next category is time. So some examples of this, could happen as early as when you're reaching out to set up an initial meeting. Could be, I don't have time to meet. Could be a very common one that we find is, the event is too soon. We don't have enough lead time. We don't have enough runway to actually maximize this. So we'll wait until next year. Could be there's too much of a time commitment. So could be questions around resources as well. So like I said, these time objections can come up as early as when you're reaching out. Really can occur kind of throughout. But so what are some ways on the time objections? How can you help overcome those?
Well, first of all, you also have to acknowledge that sometimes people use any of these objections just to get you to go away. And, just like you do, if someone calls you and they want to sell you insurance and you're not interested in buying insurance, you might say, send me an email, call me back in 6 months, I'm busy, or it's too expensive. So part of it is people have a tendency not to like saying no. So when someone says, you've got to be careful that you're not always either too early or too late. And if you're always too early or too late, it means it's not necessarily a real objection. So if the event's coming up if someone says to you it's too late, our event's in a month or 2 months, saying, okay, I understand. And again, this is agreeing. Saying, when's the typical time that you make these decisions? Now, they may still be able to do something on, or, our budget. But if they say we need a 6-month runway, say, great. So, our event is next July. Can I call you? Can we set up a meeting January 10th? So I want to get ahead. I want to be ahead of the game for next year's event. So I'm saying, make sure that you delve in a little bit deeper to really understand what the time objection is. And then again, years go by quickly. That's also a great thing about budgets. Budgets tend to be annual. Very few people say, I've set my budget for the next 10 years. Yeah. So usually there's a window, and 1 year comes by quickly. If you're a municipality, it's not far away to 2019 or 2020 or 2021. So be at the front of the line for the following year. Don't be in a short-term panic necessarily. So it's really trying to understand how true that objection is.
Yeah. I know we've also talked about, ways you can, if it is our budget's, spent for the year, can we get you in this year, but, kind of earmark the first kind of part of your budget next year for this. Or
right. That's a great thing too, right? I think you should be open to somebody coming to this year's event, but putting it in next year's budget. Companies, just as you said, or there's ways to even break that question down. Oh, your budget spent. Do you mind if I ask? And do you mind if I ask is a really good word because it allows you some ease to the next question. Yeah. Do you mind if I ask how your budgets work? Is the sponsorship have its own element? Is it a total marketing budget? Is it determined by region? I think the more information you can get on budget, both, and I know I'm mixing time and money here, but the time of the budget and the money and how it works and how they make spending decisions and how many people have to make those decisions. Just questions are really good. That intel is really important.
Yeah. Right. So the third category is product. So some examples of that, we're not interested in X, or a lot of companies this doesn't align with our pillars. So many companies will have, they'll even put it on their website. They'll say, these are our sponsorship pillars. So, Scotiabank may say we're in hockey, the arts, and running events. And if your event doesn't fit within one of those pillars, that might be an objection you face as well. So.
Right, but here's a good objection. Let's say you're in your hockey, and if you go on, I don't know, Burger King's website, and it says we want to invest in literacy and reducing obesity, or nutritional information, and you say, well, if you come to them as a hockey team, well, that totally doesn't fit in their pillars. If you say we're doing a food drive, and you say we're doing a food drive, and we know one of your pillars is to fight childhood obesity, and we do a food drive to fight childhood obesity, and we'd like to call it, would you be interested in being the Burger King food drive? That does fit their pillar. To expect them to think about that is totally unrealistic. You're a hockey team, but by doing some research and looking at who their company is, that's going to make it a lot easier for you to fit into the pillars. And you have to take that information back, and then decide who you are. And again, if you're coming at them from, hey, we're the city of Ajax, hey, we're the Oshawa Generals, the company doesn't care. They're Burger King, or their investors group, or their whatever that company is. And again, you have to think about what they're thinking about rather than who you are.
Right. Yeah. So you can be a little bit more malleable and kind of bend a little bit to what their objectives are, and still remain honest and still create something that's really win-win.
Right. But do your research. I think the mistake oftentimes, we talk a lot about listening. Listening's important, but also do your research. Go on companies' websites. Go on, do a search under investors group sponsorship in Canada and find some of the things they've done. And then those are things you can talk about. Hey, we noticed you sponsored a curling event. How'd you like it? How'd that work? Oh, it was great, or we're not doing that anymore. The fact that you've looked that up, again, you want to get to that place where it's less about your product and more about what their needs are and how your product fits into what their needs are.
Sure. So product objections could also relate to the target audience.
Yeah.
So it could be something along the lines of, we don't think there's enough of an audience fit here.
Yeah.
That could be a tough one to overcome. Any kind of thoughts on how you could overcome something like that?
I think the knowledge of understanding your own, again, as we said at the beginning, sometimes you're not gonna fit it exactly, and there's going to be times where you walk away and say, I appreciate that, and maybe it's not the right demographic. But the more you understand about what they're looking for, they say, we don't know if it's family driven. And then if you can say, well, we actually have more families come to this event, or it's the second largest family event in Pickering. Well, maybe that meets with their objection or decision makers. So it won't be perfect, but again, I think it goes back to if you can know some information going in and know what your event is and know what they want, I think it pacifies a lot of it.
Sure. And then, assets as well, another product objection, when you get down into kind of the real granular elements of the proposal,
Yep.
And you're including, X sign here and PA announcements, you may find some product objections on, we don't like the PA announcements. We don't want those.
Right. And that's a good example. We were just dealing with a company, won't mention the name of the company, but the company was really big on, or the event was really big on selling naming rights. So you'd call it the blank event. And what they never bothered to ask the company was, were they interested in naming rights? Well, it turns out the company has no interest in naming rights. So by not offering something that the company wants, so for instance, when you do these gold, silver, bronze, ABC packages, and you're saying, hey, you get a sign and you get this, a lot of groups will come out and say, you get this, this, and this. You get to be on our website. Well, did you ask the company? Maybe they just want couponing. Maybe they just want to be part of your social media. Maybe they just want a visual. Maybe they want signage. Maybe all they want is product placement. So if you're coming at them with a preset menu, you run the risk. It's like, I always liken it to a restaurant. If somebody goes on and talks to you, we have the best chicken in the world and it's great, and do you know about our chicken? And they never asked you if you're a vegetarian. They wasted their time. It doesn't matter how good their chicken is. So if they say, do you like chicken? And you say, actually, I'm a vegetarian, their whole approach is going to be different. So, we have a great vegetarian plate. totally different approach. But again, if you don't do your research and you don't listen, you open yourself up to go in the wrong places. So talking about those assets, that if you're presenting things that they have a history with or don't have an interest in, then you're shooting yourself in the foot by it. But if you know more information, you can tailor the menu to the individual.
Of the three categories, do you find that there's one type of objection that is hardest to overcome? Like I might think that product would be if they really, those audience questions, or, we don't want to sponsor a hockey team or something like that. Like that might be the harder ones to overcome. But do you find a harder one?
I don't know if there's one that I would say is harder than others. I think the hardest, I think it's more about the people. So I think if you're talking a lot of sponsorship decisions, and I think this can be a mistake, that oftentimes you think, well, RBC doesn't want to sponsor hockey. Oftentimes it might be that John Smith at RBC thinks sports is a waste of money. I think the biggest objection is often the people. And you can break that down by getting to know the people a little bit better. The more time you spend with individuals, you often, to me, can break those objections down to smaller and smaller pieces. So I know it's not a straight answer, but I don't think one jumps out and say, hey, for me, I think the good news is I don't very often run across something and I think, well, I couldn't, with more time, we couldn't kind of come to a solution. You don't always get the time. You could get somebody on the phone and say, we're not doing any sponsorship, and you don't get the meeting and you don't get the time. But I often find if you're in the room with somebody for a half an hour, and you really can understand it, a lot of these objections can go away.
So one technique. So once you've kind of identified, at least just in your mind, you've identified what you think the true objection is. So one technique that we kind of like is called the feel, felt, found technique. It's an actual tactical way to address a concern or an objection on their end, and do it from a non-argumentative way. So the way the technique works is, first step is feel, and really what that's all about is about showing empathy. It's about showing that you're actually listening to their objection and that you hear them. So I completely understand how you feel. So that would be the first step. Second is felt, and that stage offers some validation to their concern. So a couple of my clients have felt similarly or felt the same way. So you're offering them validation. They aren't the only one in the world who's ever felt that objection. Yeah. You're not suggesting to them that's a stupid objection. They're saying, lots of people have felt that way, and I hear you. And the last one is, this is where you're inserting your rebuttal. Is however, those same clients found that, and insert your answer there. So a really great way to address objections. Really coming at it from a perspective of empathy and validation, and then you're not arguing and you're offering your solution. Yeah,
I think you have to be. First of all, it's a great model. I think a great concept. I think you have to be careful it's not too contrived. So I personally don't like using the 3 words verbatim, because I've had people use that on me, and then I'm like, okay, feel, felt, found. I hear what you're saying. So to me, a version of that is, the first part's really important, which is, okay, and however you say it, everybody should use their own. Part of this too is using your own. So I might say, I hear you, or okay, that's a really good point. Like, so I think that acknowledgement, as you say, so you're not arguing. And the second part is good too, which is that you're not alone. In other words, someone says, we don't like hockey. Say, okay, I hear what you're saying. Lots of people have said that. Lots of people feel that way. Lots of people, we've heard that a lot. There's lots of our current sponsors that really don't like hockey at all. There's lots of our fans that are not hockey fans. Yeah. So that middle ground, and then, and this really is how you get around it. So what those people found is, it's a great place to spend quality time with your kids. Yeah. So here, it's a great, some of your customers, we found that some of your customers would really love coming out to a game, that the customer experience has been great. So I would say it's a very good guideline, because it brings you from, I hear what you're saying, you're not alone, and here's a solution that people have had. I think the only caution I would say is, be careful on using the words verbatim because it's an old theory. A lot of people have read the book and know this. So I think just put it in your own words.
Right, for sure. And it goes along with I know you touched on this earlier, but those things like do you mind if I ask why, right? And things like that. Just ways to really ease it so you're not coming at it from an argumentative standpoint, and they're feeling less defensive about their objection and more open to.
Yeah, we talk about, I call them cushion expressions, and I think like to cushion the blow. Like I think things like, I hope I'm not being too intrusive, or do you mind if I ask, or my apologies if this is too personal, but or no problem if you're not able to tell me, but it would really help if I could get a sense of your budget. The no problem if you can't tell me, the reality is they might say I can't tell you, but it's more chance that A, they tell you, and B, what I think is the most important is it gets you to spit it out. Very few people are comfortable saying what's your budget or what's your maximum budget. But if you say it would really help us to not waste your time, to give you a proposal that's fitting, if I could get a sense of what your maximum budget would be. There was 25 words in the beginning, but they allowed us to actually have the proper conversation. So yeah, I think those cushioning statements are important because a lot of people will hear this theory and won't do it. They'll say, well, I didn't feel comfortable saying, how do you, I understand what you're saying. Like, you have to be able to dig deeper. You can't, if you take an objection and walk away, you're leaving lots of customers, clients that would be interested, but you didn't really ask the right questions.
Right. So before just leading up to today's webinar, I had a chance to ask several of our colleagues for some objections that they face in their day-to-day process. So I figured we could spend a little bit of time, go through a couple of these ones. Some of them are quite common. So probably ones that people that are on the watching on the webinar have faced as well. So so the first one, we've had we had a bad experience in the past. So it could be, we've done sponsorship before, had a really bad experience, probably not going to do it again, or something along those lines.
Right. So that's a good one, because I think what you can say is, okay, that's too bad. I'd like to really hear about your experience. If you don't mind, you have a couple minutes, I'd like to really understand what happened. And by doing that, you can try and differentiate yourself or understand what happened, or say, that's terrible, or that's not something we could do. Or again, yes, it's wide open. They could say all kinds of things, and experience will make you ready on how to handle when they say, here's what happened, A, B, C, and D. But people want to tell that story. If they use that as the objection, sponsorships never worked for us. It's been terrible. Sorry to hear. Do you mind telling me what did you sponsor and why didn't it work? And what'll happen is oftentimes what they're doing may be really different than what you're doing. Yeah. Or there may be some similarities, and then you work backwards. So I think on that one, and you'll see a lot of my answers will have some similarity. But on that one, it's saying, okay, tell me about it. Yeah. Like, what happened? That's bad. You've got to get them past hating sponsorship, for lack of a better word, in order to even talk about your stuff.
Yeah, right? For sure.
So, okay.
So one we've kind of touched on, our budget is set for the year.
Yeah.
Not sure if the reach is large enough. So there might be events on that are watching this webinar that could be relatively small events, and there's going to be some that are huge and draw a mass audience. So if you're one of the smaller ones, kind of what.
Right. So one thing I would say in general, I don't think it's a term that you have up here, but one thing I like a lot is if you can't fix it, feature it. So let's say you have an event. So some people will be listening and say, oh, well, they're talking about big events in Oshawa Generals, and we have an event that has 400 people. Say, well, what's the good in that? Well, the good in that is there's generally in smaller events, there's a higher level of loyalty. There's less sponsors. There's a chance for a sponsor to really resonate with the group because, there's one company that I was just, Evan, we were at an event together that was sponsored RBC. In my mind, we did a Spoke to McMaster in front of, 100 people? Couldn't have been, at most it was 100 people, maybe 75 people. They had one sponsor, RBC. RBC provided some bags. They talked about their branch on campus. Well, that's pretty powerful for RBC. Now you could say, well, why would RBC who's, I think they're still the biggest, most successful bank in Canada. Why would they waste their time spending money with 75 McMaster students? Well, because TD and CIBC, let alone Tim Hortons and Canadian Tire, aren't in the room. And those people at the McMaster Sports Management Academy might feel a really strong affinity for RBC and might actually switch banks because they say, you know what? I'm not loyal to a credit union or a bank, but RBC sponsors my association. I'm going to switch banks. So just in general, you can't fix it. You can't take that event that's 400 people and make it 5,000. So talk about those things as a positive, the loyalty, and that there's less sponsors and that you can reach the individuals one-on-one and that kind of stuff.
For sure. The decision comes from above me. I'm not the ultimate decision maker. I have to run this by my VP or boss or the owner of the company or something.
I think that's a good one. I think what you can say is what I like to say, and that is no problem. Do you mind if, you and I, so you're talking to the person, let's say it's a marketing manager and the vice president of marketing makes a decision, say the marketing manager. If you don't, it would be great if you and I, or I can present with you there to that person for a few minutes. Say now you don't always get the opportunity to do that. They may say, no, I can handle it and I can do that. But I think one of the things you want to ask for is you do want, that's an important one. And you want the decision maker whenever possible to be in the room. So I think you want to go out of your way to the person you're meeting with is not going to present your product as well as you are. Right. So I think on that one, if you can encourage them, that it would be great if, I have an opportunity to be in front of a few minutes to speak to you and your boss. By the way, don't say your boss without you. So that takes them out of the picture, and that's not healthy. So I think you say, would you mind if you and I talk to your manager together, and even use things like it might save you some time. It might be simpler if I'm in the room to kind of help it along.
For sure. So similar one is might be a pretty common one is we have an agency that handles our sponsorship. So how would you kind of handle that?
So two parts. So I think this is one of those agreements. So you'd say, happy to talk to the agency, and could you give me the contact information? That's part A. But also B, saying, prior to me meeting with the agency, it would be really great to understand what are your objectives, because I don't, obviously they're your agency and you work with them, and again, happy to go see them, but what's important, just so I know when I talk to your agency what's important for you. So I think the second part's really important. If you can go to the agency and you've already talked to the client, that helps. Or you can also, if they're that blunt, we have an agency that handles this. It's tricky, but sometimes they're more subtle. They may say, we generally work with an agency. So if they say something like that, you'd say, well, are there certain decisions that Toyota makes? Remember, a company can drive the agency. So if you're meeting with Toyota and they like what you're doing, they may have an agency, but they will call up the agency and say, I want to work with Evan. Well, then the agency's paid to respond to what the client wants. So a lot of, don't be excited to go to the agency. It's generally a much harder once you're at the agency level than when you're with the client directly.
Yeah, for sure. So there's too much going on right now. It's really a time one.
Yeah, that's a timing. I think that is just saying no problem. When do things settle down and you might have a few minutes to get together. So I think that's just saying, but don't say, okay, I'll call, try and pin something down. Try and find out when they're not going to be as hectic.
Yeah. This one, the wording probably, I'm not sure you're going to hear this exact wording, but we sponsor your competitor. How would you kind of overcome that?
Well, it depends. I mean, I think if I'm an event, if somebody says to me, so we, I think mentioned we run the Brampton Beast hockey team. So somebody might say, oh, we sponsor the Mississauga Steelheads, which are the closest team. It's probably the most, if you had to identify one competitor. So Buffalo Wild Wings, for instance, a big sponsor of the Steelheads. And they would say, hey, we sponsor your competitor. So my answer would be, great. It's great. What do you mean it's great? So yeah, well, you guys could have an opportunity to reach both teams in the Peel region. It's great that you sponsor the Leafs or the Oshawa Generals or this other festival. By sponsoring them and us, you can double your energy and reach all of them. So to me, that's that's an easy one. And I think what I hope you get, and Evan's been with me when we've done this, is you guys could send any objection you want. You could send 100 objections. We're gonna have answers for all of them. And the point is, don't be intimidated. Now, some are better than others. You know, the decision maker one says, "Yeah, I'd like to get in front of the decision maker," and then there's a second. It's a Venn diagram. If they say no, what do you do then? They say you can't meet with the decision maker. I said, no problem. Maybe you and I could talk through it a little bit more. Or what else can I do to make your proposal to your boss easier or more palatable? So I'm just saying there's answers to every objection. They're not always perfect, but there's something you can say in every situation. So there shouldn't be we're done. And I'll just give you sort of extreme. Some people say, give me a couple extreme ones. Just one is, when you do the weather's bad, so you have an event, you can't do anything, it's raining. I said, well, you could have, someone could have bought earlier. And if they buy earlier, they're more likely to come in that situation. Somebody could say, and I don't want to be some morbid here, but I say, because it's extreme, somebody says, well, we used to go and somebody passed away or somebody moved out of town or something. I think obviously the answer is we're really sorry to hear that. There may be, and that may be it. That may be the end of the discussion, but oftentimes there's a situation where there may be someone else in the family or somebody else that lives there or somebody that didn't go or somebody else that wants to participate in the event. So I guess all I would say is there's an answer for everything. I think the key is not to be intimidated by circumstances and what the objections are.
For sure. So as we said, you're gonna face tons of objections. You and your team are gonna face more and more over time, and just like most things with experience, you're gonna get better at recognizing, okay, where is this price, time, product objection, and you're gonna have some answers ready to go. We always, suggest, especially for teams where there's multiple people selling, have an internal kind of document, a frequently asked questions type of document that's sharing, okay, these are the objections we're hearing about the sponsorship for the event, and here's how I've handled it, and here's how I found it effective to handle it, and updating it periodically as new objections emerge and better ways of answering things come up. But a good way to build upon the organizational learning and over time and share some best practices within your team. So. Great. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So hopefully the takeaways from today were that objections can really be boiled down to one of those three categories. It can be a price, time, or product, or some sort of overlap between multiple. But the key really is trying to understand what's the true objection. So someone might offer that price objection, they might offer the time one, but there might be some more underlying reason why they're really just trying to either be polite and blow you off a little bit, but you want to try to understand that true objection. So you want to do yourself a favor, and it really can help with building trust and building that relationship, that you have answers kind of ready to go, and that you're experienced with handling those types of objections. So you want to kind of have some of those answers ready to go, and you want to come at it from a place, not using the words feel, felt, found exactly, but coming at it from a place where you're showing that you're listening to them, you're showing the empathy, you're validating their concern, that it's not, that it's a concern that many people face, and they're not alone, and you're offering a constructive suggestion, one that's coming from their best interest and not purely your own. So, so hopefully those are takeaways from today. Michael, do we have any questions?
A couple of questions. So say you have a meeting scheduled with the people, and the primary decision maker is not able to make it. Is it worth rescheduling the meeting, or should you still stick to your original date?
I think you should. It's good, very good question. So we're asked. I think that you generally, it depends. Actually depends. I think if you can reschedule a meeting that the decision maker is going to be in for relatively soon, I would reschedule it if the key person is going to be there soon. If it looks like the decision maker is not going to be available for a long period of time and you can meet with somebody else, then I would do it. So I think timings, if you really feel like it's rescheduled, so shortly thereafter and the decision maker is going to be there, then yeah, I schedule. I think that that's, you know, sometimes there's more than one decision maker, but I think if you really, as the person asked the question, if you know that the important person had a scheduling change, I think you want to acknowledge that they're important.
Great. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more. So say the people you're presenting to do want a discount on the event or the proposal that you've put forward. How would you steer them away from trying to dissect your rate card? So how do you kind of convince them to allow you to keep control of what comes out and what stays in?
Okay. I think, I mean, again, good question. I think there's some give and take there. So again, if somebody used some simple numbers, if somebody says we'd like like the package that's $1,000, but we'd like to spend, we only have 500. I think what you can ask them is what's really important to you. You know, so there's 5 things in there. What's really important to you? Oftentimes you meet in the middle. They may say points number 1 and 3. We say, okay, we can give you we could do points number 1 and 3 for $500. But if you want point 4, it's going to be $700 or $800. So I think a lot of it is that's the time where you're negotiating. But I think what you don't want to do, as we said earlier, is say, okay, fine. And again, to me, you may feel like you're helping somebody out, but what's happening is you're showing a true lack of integrity, that your original price was not accurate. And eventually that's going to, companies and individuals are going to hold that against you.
Great. Okay. Great. So our next episode will be 2 weeks today, Wednesday at 2 p.m., where we're going to get through measuring sponsorship effectiveness. So believe it or not, so through our first 6 episodes, if you're actually following along in a sponsorship process, you've now handled all of their objections. You've signed a sponsor, and now you want to try to get into, we're going to talk about how to actually measure the effectiveness of that sponsorship, and go back to that sponsorship landscape study chart about the service deliverables that sponsors are looking for, and we know that a lot of them have to do with measurement and return on investment and things like that. So we're going to get into how to actually measure some of those things and deliver that back to sponsors. So again, very special thanks to Central Counties Tourism and Sport Durham for putting on today's webinar and for the webinar series. And we hope to see everybody at our next webinar in 2 weeks from today.